All across the country, and quite frankly, the globe at large, we find within synagogues, mosques, temples, churches, and other religious edifices swarms of people entering and leaving, worshiping a God that they come to know through the transmission of knowledge and human experience. Some are brought to tears as they envision His mercy in their lives through the function of gratitude and an awareness of one's blessings. And the unfortunate amongst them harbor resentment or live with confusion brought about by His elusive presence, or should I say lack thereof, in their lives, often brought about by the conflict of His description with the state of humanity in distant parts of the world, or their very own selves subject to immense suffering and toil. If anything can be discovered by the plenitude of religions, over hundreds and counting, that exist or have existed in the world, it would be that the description of God or gods takes many shapes. Yet we find that amongst the devout, the certainty for which they hold their beliefs seems unshakable, the conviction on the intent behind God's actions in their lives near and accessible, and the associations between life events and God's pleasure or displeasure conceivable and intuitive. For example, the Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, when asked by a questioner about the abuse she faces at the hands of her husband, adamantly declared that this was a punishment due to a sin she was committing and urged her to repent. Though, within the faith, there exists a different explanation for the same event, namely God's pleasure or love, for which those who are inflicted with hardship can rejoice in, given the hadith which states that God tests those whom He loves in larger measure, progressively from prophets to the devout to the lay public. This is, of course, a description of a theological reason for the suffering she faces, but not an excuse for the suffering or a plea to remain complacent. But the theological framing as a punishment frames her abuse as deserved, whereas framing it as a trial, like those of closer proximity to God, endows her with patience as she attempts to resolve these issues and end the abuse, while maintaining a firm conviction and trust in God, who is not displeased. But of course, claiming God's pleasure and claiming God's displeasure are two opposing portrayals of God, which cannot both be true. So the question remains, who is it that has properly conceptualized the divine intent in this situation? This is tied to the question of God's nature, because it is by means of our conception of God that we draw conclusions on His actions and His presence and nearness in our lives. With a large amount of conceptualizations existing across and within religious groups, can it be said that these are all human attempts to conceptualize the unknowable? Are they all equal in their inaptitude to describe the indescribable? Can the competing existences of various conceptualizations of the divine lend to what modern philosophers term a limitless criticism of theological ideas and converge to substantiate the claims of negative theology? Can we ever really use an integrally human tool such as language to describe the one beyond our worldly limitations? Can we ever use such a fallible tool as the mind to conceptualize the one beyond any limitation? This is where the idea of apophatic theology plays its part. Welcome to another episode of The Religion Inquirer, a channel dedicated to investigating religious thought, history, and influence, classically and in more modern times, with in-depth research into academic publications and opinions in the fields of theology, philosophy, religion, and religious law. Without further ado, let's dive in and explore the topic of Apophaticism on the nature of God. Unlike analytic philosophy of religion, wishing to form descriptions of the divine, apophatics claim that God eludes description and conception. To an apophatic, any description of God misses the mark, as they elevate him beyond the confines of human language. Apophaticism shows its face in many of the world's religions, from Abrahamic faiths to polytheistic traditions like Hinduism, and is said to have originated in Neoplatonic thought. In Hinduism, this is articulated in the Hindu scriptures, such as the Upanishads, where they state that Brahman's nature is outside of the pale of human comprehension. An example of this is the chant Neti Neti, meaning not this, or neither this nor that. Theologians and philosophers have articulated their views on this concept throughout history, with notable writings going back to the medieval period and beyond. Philo of Alexandria of the 1st century is reported to have said, He who is conducted by wisdom discerns this fact, that God is at a distance from every creature, and that any comprehension of him is removed to a great distance from all human intellect. God may not be named or spoken of, and is in every way incomprehensible. Also following him in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa is reported to have described the divine nature as surpassing every mental concept, further stating that it is altogether inaccessible to reasoning and conjecture, nor has there been found in any human faculty capable of perceiving the incomprehensible, for we cannot devise a means of understanding inconceivable things. These articulations of the ineffable God may cause confusion. How is it that we can ever know a God? How can you worship that which you do not know? If God evades any description, how is it that we are brought to worship him or convinced of this imperative virtue? To answer these questions, apophatics have described solutions, which I will cover later on in this video. For the time being, we will return to the principal propositions of apophatic theology and what this means for the validity of its claims. Apophatic theology is composed of the following 3 propositions. 1. We cannot know what God's nature is. 2. We cannot successfully describe God's nature. And 3. We cannot successfully conceive of God's nature. From this, we derive that human language is incapable of expressing God's nature, and that God is both greater than and different from human knowledge and thought. According to Dennis Turner, an American philosopher and theologian, given that religions make attempts to describe God by means of human language, it can be said rather that what follows from the unknowability of God is that we can have very little idea of what all these things said about God mean. According to apophatics, in fact, it is not a matter of one's proximity to God that we suffer this incapability, because otherworldly creatures, such as the angels, those of proximity to God, are imagined to occupy the same epistemological limitation category, leaving them without said knowledge of God also. This conceptualization and focus on meaning highlights the centuries-old debate that existed in the early centuries of Islam and still persists to this day, on what can really be said about God. To evade such problems at describing the indescribable, Muslims formalize the bila kaifa approach, which essentially means that God is described in such a way that is beyond any analogy in worldly conception, granting them both the certainty of revelatory accuracy and the glorification of a divine being who is literally out of this world. In this way, one stays true to the revelatory descriptions by means of turning descriptions of God into metaphors, or what is termed in Arabic, majazi readings, or taking a literalist approach while maintaining the principle of bila kaifa to steer clear of any anthropomorphic descriptions of God. Although it seems intuitive that the divine nature is beyond conception, Apophaticism goes a step further from this general proclamation by determining that it is beyond description, conception, and knowledge. Unlike the, for example, Islamic approach, which upholds the revelatory descriptions of God, apophatics do away with these also, leaving one in the dark when it comes to knowing the divine. On this note, the most notable and pronounced critique of apophaticism is termed the representation problem. This involves questioning how one can claim that God is unknowable while maintaining that he is in fact unknowable. How can one maintain any talk of God while maintaining an apophatic theology? How is it that you can both describe God as unknowable while claiming he is in fact unknowable and unlimited by description? Which, in other words, is how do you maintain apophatic tendencies without falling into the eliminativist response, which is to progressively reject more and more representations of God and in turn alter the relationship with God into one where he is not mentioned at all, the silent position. To what extent, then, would there be a continued engagement in religious thought and discourse by apophatic individuals? To approach this problem, apophatics turn to negation, which is the act of negating attributes of God without making positive affirmations of its attributes. This uses the linguistic device of apophasis, which is to speak of God in sentences that either negate a predicate ascribed to God, of the form God is not P, or else a privative term God is not P, typically by constructing an affixal negation such as in, un, or less from predicate expression. Examples of such speech would be that of Nicholas Cusa, who states God is neither nothing nor something, or John Scotus Erigena, who states, for properly speaking, there is in him neither rest nor motion. This privileging of negative language in relation to God is said to originate in the thought of the founding father of Neoplatonism, Plotinus, who asserted, "We can and do state what it, the one, is not, as opposed to what it is." By negating attributes and descriptions of God, we do not fall into the trap of speaking positively and affirming qualities about the subject at hand, which is God. So the qualities or attributes are no longer left to the imagination, but lie beyond it. This is based on the premise that a negative statement provides no truth about the thing to which this statement applies. Apophatics may also be using metalinguistic negation, which is the unwillingness to assert a given sentence or class of sentences rather than reject the truth of what is said. An example of this in practice would be if one said, "It's not possible that he will win, it is probable that he will win." In this example, one does not negate him winning, rather one uses different language to point to a different meaning. This is different from ordinary negation, which would state that God lacks a certain property, which is ultimately describing what God is not, a description of God. Why is this better? Because firstly, the apophatic can use metalinguistic negative sentences about God without representing God as lacking any qualities. Instead, they reject the appropriateness of sentences that represent God. In this way, one asserts the limits of what we ought to say about God. The Persian Ismaili Islamic scholar Abu Yaqub as-Sijistani is said to have claimed to this effect that whoever worships God by denying the attributes falls into a hidden anthropomorphism, just as someone who worships him by affirming them falls into obvious anthropomorphism, which echoes the thought of Gregory Palamas, a Byzantine Greek Christian theologian, who states, "The excellence of him who surpasses all things is not only beyond all affirmation, but also beyond all negation. It exceeds all excellence that is attainable by the mind." Another way of avoiding the representation problem is the consideration of category mistakes, which is, if we consider descriptions of God category mistakes, in that one cannot say God is being nor non-being, the same way one cannot prescribe happiness or unhappiness to the color red, it avoids the representation problem by negating both positive and negative descriptions of God. In this way, we do not seek to represent something we consider unrepresentable, or what apophatics may say is indescribable or unfathomable. On the subject of sentences that commit category mistakes, there are three main positions. Number one, they are false. Number two, they lack a truth value. And number three, they are senseless. The most promising of these positions is that explained by Bertrand Russell, in his saying that category mistakes are senseless. If we were to take this position, it would then follow that both negative and positive descriptions of God are non-representation, given that they do not contain representational content, which would counter the claims made by the representation problem. Though, it must be said that this position does not hold its weight, because, from the point of view of language, all sentences contain meaning, as much as they are grammatically coherent. In this way, it is not the meaninglessness of language used in positive or negative descriptions of God that is proposed by apophatics, rather it is the inadequacy. Another response to the representation problem is the idea of fictionalism, which claims that one can make statements about God being X that are used to do something other than to express the belief that God is X, without any commitment to God being X. In this way, one can say that God is furious concerning the sin of sinners, for a prudential purpose, in order to intervene on sinners' propensity towards sinfulness, and encourage repentance. Though the statement itself is known to be false, and not actually true, it serves a pragmatic function in encouraging people to be virtuous while discouraging the engagement in sin. This would serve to inspire the unsophisticated masses who do not realize their falsity, as well as everyone else, including the apophatics, as a means of achieving goodness in humanity. As Gregory of Nyssa says on the topic of Bible descriptions of God, the Bible informs us in every word of this kind. I believe that the divine providence deals with our feebleness by means of our own characteristics, so that those inclining to sin may restrain themselves from evils through fear of punishment. Those convicted may not despair when they perceive the opportunity of gaining mercy by change of heart, and those who live rightly may by strictness of conduct take more in delight in their virtues, as by their own way of life they give joy to the one who becomes the provider of good things. This is useful to the apophatics who do not deny that there is a God, but who do not find the representations of God's nature are seemingly true. Although it can be said this is only a partial solution to the representation problem, since apophatics cannot use fictionalism for components 2 and 3 of apophaticism, namely that we cannot fully describe God's nature nor conceive of it. If one were to follow through with fictionalism, one would fall into the problem of denying apophaticism altogether, given that you are ascribing attributes to God and conceiving of them in order to serve prudential ends. Next, we have reductionism, which is to find a reduced class of statements, in this case ones compatible with apophaticism, that give truth conditions for statements that seem, on their face, to be about something which is taken to be philosophically contentious. In this case, representations of God. In this category lies the earlier response of negation, which is to make negative statements about God, as well as statements about God's actions, and thirdly, statements about the world. In this way, statements are made about what God is not like, what God does rather than what he is, or about the world rather than God himself. An example of reductionist statements about God's actions is a statement of Maimonides, a well-known medieval Jewish philosopher, who says, Whenever any one of his actions is perceived by us, we ascribe to God that emotion which is the source of the act when performed by ourselves, and call him by an epithet which is formed from the verb expressing that emotion. We see, for example, how well he provides for the life of embryos of living beings, how he endows with certain faculties both the embryo itself and those who have to rear it after its birth, in order that it may be protected from death and destruction, guarded against all harm, and assisted in the performance of all that is required for its development. Similar acts, when performed by us, are due to a certain emotion and tenderness called mercy and pity. God is therefore said to be merciful. This is also related to the principle expressed by Philo of Alexandria, and echoed by Clement of Alexandria, Origen, and Gregory of Nyssa, that God is unknowable in its essence, but knowable through its activity. Though again, just as was proposed in regards to the response of fictionalism, this does not account for the propositions 2 and 3 of Apophaticism, because it both describes God and conceives of this description. As we have seen, to make sense of God's description in Revelation, while maintaining his distinction from human attributes by means of his divine essence, apophatics have approached descriptions of God with a type of ardent skepticism, claiming that one cannot describe, know, nor conceive of God's nature. As we have seen, this theological claim brings the many contentions, the most evident of which is the representation problem. Has this problem been resolved? Can we really claim both an ineffable God and use the tool of human language to express this unknowable reality? Were theists of other theological leanings more successful in their attempts to both conceptualize the divine and separate his description from anthropomorphic associations? In future videos, I'll speak more on the nature of God as a religious inquiry, with more of what has been proposed in this area in analytic philosophy, such as ultimism and anthropomorphism, and how these exist in historical, theological writings and philosophical expositions of the modern period. So, if this is a topic that interests you, subscribe to my website and also to my channel so you can access these writings as well as videos as soon as they become available. For references, you can check the description, and I will see you in the next video. This has been the religious inquiry of Apophatism and the nature of God, and I hope it has endowed you with as much insight as I have gained in this regard, and I hope to see you in future videos. Thank you so much, and take care.